Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Stewarts Soundbites. I'm so looking forward to this session today, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Dr. Stephen Dunne. First of all, welcome and thank you so much, Stephen, for being with us.
Thanks for having me. Honestly, it's a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. And so Stephen's a researcher and a senior lecturer of psychology at Sunderland University. I know that's changing in the new year. Stephen, you're moving to Northumberland, so
Northumbria, sorry, yeah.
We have such an interesting topic today. Stephen's been doing some absolutely brilliant research on kind of the correlation between loneliness and people with how brain injured people experience loneliness during lockdown compared to non-brain injured people. But I'm actually not going to explain it, Stephen, because you're going to explain it to me. And that's my first question is just tell us a little bit about your project and your research project.
You were spot on, to be fair. You probably explained it better than I have. So it's a collaboration with Headway and also a research assistant of mine who's been doing a fair amount of the work as well, Chloe Bradbury. So we were really interested in the experiences of brain injury survivors in terms of how they've experienced lockdown and with a specific focus on loneliness. We've been researching loneliness for a while. We've had a publication recently accepted around loneliness in stroke survivors in the northeast of England. And that was prior to lockdown. So when lockdown happened, we were really interested in what are specific populations feeling now that we are all socially distanced from each other and there are these measures in place. So over the course of the summer from probably about March, April time till a couple of months ago when lockdown measures were lifted, we've been interviewing brain injury survivors and what I would call neurotypical individuals, so individuals who haven't had a brain injury, and just asking them about their experiences of lockdown, how they feel about things opening up again as well, obviously. And generally the results have been, we're currently analysing the data, so everything's preliminary at the moment. I'll put that out as a sort of a start. But at the moment, really interesting results are starting to come out and interesting themes developing from brain injury survivors' experiences.
Yeah. And well, you've said that it's obviously the outcome of it is not, it's in the preliminary stages and you're still analysing, I know that, but it's not top secret though.
No, not at all. No,
so can you just tell us a little bit about the preliminary, because when we spoke about this before, I just found it so interesting and I think some people find it surprising. I wonder, could you just tell us a little bit about what you're finding? What are the patterns you're seeing?
Yeah, I think one of the first things I was thinking when things happened was that people would potentially experience lockdown similarly. So everyone would feel some element of, I personally was feeling some element of loneliness and isolation throughout the lockdown period. When talking to brain injury survivors, this didn't seem to be as problematic. So a lot of brain injury survivors, spoke about how they actually felt like nothing changed over the course of the pandemic. I'm sure that that's not the experiences of everyone, but a lot of brain injury survivors that we spoke to, the vast majority, spoke about how that there wasn't as many issues as they were expecting or as they were hearing about other people, their friends who were neurotypical, who hadn't had a brain injury, had experience, for example. And I think one of the ways that we're trying to rationalize this is this potential level of adaptation that comes with sustaining a brain injury. Potentially brain injury survivors have had that period of adaptation prior to lockdown, and then us as neurotypical individuals who haven't had a brain injury are now going through a period of time during lockdown where we're having to adapt to a completely different situation, something that brain injury survivors have already experienced because of their brain injury. And a lot of brain injury survivors spoke about this in terms of, there's one particular quote which I think you quite liked as well when we were talking about it, was this idea that lockdown created this level playing field in brain injury survivors' lives, whereby for the first time they felt seen by their friends who hadn't had a brain injury, and there was an increased level of awareness, is what a lot of brain injury survivors were saying, towards how they felt and how they've adapted and kind of the things they've been going through in their brain injury, which is a really interesting concept to try and think about.
Yeah, really interesting. I really did. I've thought about that a lot since we spoke, which was quite some time ago now, actually, and applied it to been thinking about it in the context of the members of my own headway group as well, and thinking back on conversations that we've had during lockdown on Zoom. And I think one of the most interesting things that I have thought about a couple of times actually is how lockdown, a lot of us that we're used to going to restaurants and cinemas and that's not always the case for people who sustain a brain injury. They quite often find those busier environments very overwhelming. And so going for a walk with a friend is actually what they would prefer to be doing. And do you think in that sense it's helped people without brain injuries kind of empathize a bit more and understand it and think more about how they are with brain injured friends or family?
I think so. Based on the findings, absolutely. And that was one of the points that was raised by a couple of people as well, was this idea that after a brain injury, the brain injury survivors that we specifically spoke to had issues doing these more social events that were in, for example, pubs or going to the cinema or due to the associated fatigue or concentration issues or associated things with the brain injury. And what lockdown did was create a scenario where, all anyone could really do realistically was go for a walk or go find time in nature, which was actually, from an empirical standpoint as well, there's a lot of evidence to show that attachment or affiliation with nature increases things like mindfulness, particularly post brain injury and things as well. Like, it's really positive experiences in nature. So it created a really positive environment where brain injury survivors were able to reconnect with friends and family potentially that they weren't able to before, and potentially in a way that they weren't able to before. However, although that awareness existed, what a lot of brain injury survivors mentioned was that awareness was raised whilst the pandemic was ongoing. But as things started to open up a little bit more, so obviously the UK has been a weird situation where things have opened up slightly, then gone back a little bit, then opened up again. And when things started to open up again, when, for example, the pubs opened up, a lot of brain injury survivors mentioned that as a particular time where that level of awareness dropped again, and their friends were straight back out into the pubs, doing things, doing activities that, the brain injury survivors in our study then were unable to join in with or didn't want to join in with again. And that is when they felt, they were dropped again, effectively. There was this particular quote that I really like, is that idea of everyone's got their own lives to lead and do what they want to do. We just get left behind, which is absolutely poignant in terms of, that awareness was at a point where the brain injury survivors in our interview thought excellent, but then as soon as things opened up again, things went back to normal. The status quo was resumed. So that's where a lot of the issues have come when we've asked questions about now, with things opening up even more. We're in a position now where pretty much freedom is back. And that has been a massive point of anxiety and a massive point of contention in the interviews that we've had with brain injury survivors about society returning to normal and the issues that they will then face, and the awareness will then be diminished again.
Yeah. And I've seen that as well. So I've experienced that in real time with clients and with Headway members as well. And I think for some of them, obviously, there's clinical vulnerabilities as well, that on top of being left behind, they're clinically more anxious about doing things because they're in a more vulnerable spot. And of course, everything's still up in the air with how effective vaccinations are and how long they'll last and all that sort of thing. What I wanted to just touch on, because it was something that I found really interesting in our conversation before this webinar, was the distinction, basically how people are defining loneliness, which I had never applied my mind to until our conversation. And as well, and you've already distinguished, just probably without even thinking about it, between loneliness and social isolation. And I just wanted to explore that a little bit.
Yeah, so there is a clear difference between loneliness and social isolation. Loneliness is this distressing feeling of being alone or being separated from individuals, whereas social isolation is that lack of direct social contact or having a few, not many people to interact with socially regularly. Now, so this is an important distinction to make, particularly in academia. It's important to draw those sort of clear boundaries between the two levels of what is isolation and what is actually loneliness, because they are very different concepts. However, the definitions in this study, we got one thing we wanted to know was how brain injury survivors defined loneliness and what does loneliness mean to them. And they were frequently referring to the idea of being alone when they defined loneliness. But people have, particularly researchers who look at loneliness, they warn against using sort of aloneness and lonely, these two concepts, aloneness and loneliness, interchangeably. But brain injury survivors, this is also repeated in research that we've done previously with the stroke survivors as well. The exact same finding there, where they actually can't differentiate between those two concepts. So those two concepts are inextricably linked, I found really interesting. There were all, there's other stuff that I think is more like readily known in terms of the issues that are associated with a brain injury. So, for example, cognitive aspects, the physical aspects, the loss of physical abilities as well, difficulty in communication with others. All of these things lead to this idea of, I guess, potentially creating a social distance from people generally, and that can obviously lead to this greater aspect of aloneness and therefore loneliness. So if we're looking at drivers for why that happens, then you have these sort of physical aspects which lead, or cognitive aspects which lead to this aspect of aloneness, or why people would define it as being alone. One of the more interesting ones is the idea of identity aloneness as well, I guess. So the idea that after a brain injury, someone's identity would change. They may not be the breadwinner anymore, for example, or there may be those personality changes or personality aspects that change as well. Their identity within their own family or among their friends, how they've viewed themselves may change. And that can also lead to, aspects of loneliness as well, or a definition of loneliness as being alone. So there's multiple, that is easier to draw it, I guess. I have a whiteboard, but it would be effectively trying to draw this out in terms of what constitutes how people define loneliness. Was a multitude of different things in terms of how they view themselves, how their identity has changed, whether they are actually physically alone from people. Peer support was always something that was mentioned quite a lot as well. Feeling alone among others, for example, family members, but not feeling alone among peers. And obviously you talk about headway. Peer support is obviously a massive positive for brain injury, for a load of different issues, but for brain injury survivors, especially based on a lot of research, peer support is something that a lot of our brain injury survivors mentioned, and they mentioned headway a significant amount of time as well in terms of how important those groups are to them. The ability to have.
So you had probably slightly different angles, maybe from somebody that has that peer support in place and somebody that doesn't.
Definitely, yeah. So that's one of the things that we do want to look at in a bit more detail. Is we know out of our brain injury survivors who did attend headway and who maybe hasn't attended any headway sessions or anything like that, who hasn't been involved with support groups. So one thing we want to look at is the differences between those two accounts of loneliness, for example, and specifically with the focus on peer support, because we know that's such a massive aspect and massive positive for brain injury survivors, for a whole host of other chronic illness issues as well.
Yeah. So interesting. I mean, I could just talk to you about this all day.
I know I've prattled on there if it is.
No, not at all. It's so interesting. And the kind of final thing that I wanted to touch upon was in relation to kind of family and carers of those with brain injuries. And it's funny because we've got a question in the Q&A box, which is, in your opinion, how would neurotypical support those with brain injury during lockdown or in general? I suppose I was going to ask you about the carers and family members of brain injury survivors and how they have experienced loneliness during lockdown, and whether their kind of role has changed, or did you have any insight on that, really?
It's a really hard issue, that, because a couple of the interviews we did were with a brain injury survivor, for example, and their spouse or a family member. And it was really interesting hearing the different points of view. And particularly, one of the things I'm really interested in doing next is looking at, there's a lot of research that has been done already on, the role of the carer in brain injury, and, how those roles change. basically, from the interviews that we did with brain injury survivors and those who had a carer with them, not only was a carer dealing with the the particular changes that happen or arise as of someone having a brain injury, they were also dealing with the loneliness that they felt themselves during lockdown. So there was obviously an exacerbated aspect to themselves. That lockdown was one thing that shouldn't be understated, is that lockdown was an extremely hard experience for pretty much the majority of people. And I reckon, as we move through the coming months and years, we'll be seeing that from a mental health perspective, constantly and consistently. And particularly one thing I want to focus on is future research addressing those particular areas in relation to the role of the carer in supporting brain injury survivors. It's hard for me to give an opinion on what would be the best way to actually do that, because I think it's going to depend on a multitude of things. But one of the key things that brain injury survivors mentioned themselves was something like the importance of peer support. So, for example, one of the things that can work well for carers as well is additionally peer support. So, carers supporting other carers and actually having environments where you can actually have those conversations with other individuals who are also carers for brain injury survivors. Because you're going through a similar experience. Peer support is plays such a huge role in resilience and maintaining mental health.
Absolutely. And there is a real focus, especially within in a lot of the headway groups, upon it being a network for brain injury survivors, but also for their carers and family to have time to speak to other people in the same position. And that's something that we try and work hard on in our group especially. And one last thing, I know I'm pushing it, aren't I? I'm going to get told off, but one last thing, I just had another quick question. Was it your experience with the study, Stephen, that the level of brain injury created or contributed to a different level of loneliness? Did you see any patterns in that regard?
We didn't actually. The severity of the brain injury didn't really have an impact on loneliness level. It kind of there seems to be a perfect cocktail, if you will, of symptoms that would lead to potential creation of loneliness, for example. So one of the things that would be interesting to look at in this data, specifically when we get an opportunity to properly delve into it, would be looking at, one of the things we looked at was symptomology. So, for example, if someone has speech and language issues, does that lead to them being more lonely or more socially isolated, for example? And is that the same with someone who potentially just has a cognitive issue on its own, or associated cognitive and physical mobility issues? So actually looking at it from the perspective of the associated symptomology and whether or not that leads to increases in loneliness, for example, or a higher measure of loneliness on particular scales, which is something we can talk about at some point in potentially another one, because I'm not going to take up too much time, is something actually to look at down the line. Apologies to keep saying future research, but that is pretty much where we're at. This project was mainly about defining the problem, and this problem exists, and exploring it in terms of the next steps for this are exploring it in terms of, well, what can we actually do to alleviate it? So we are looking now at what interventions currently exist and can they be utilized for brain injury survivors, because that's the big step. At the moment, generally we know what could work for loneliness among people who haven't had a brain injury, but does that actually apply to individuals who have had a brain injury? Does that overcome things like physical issues? Does it overcome speech and language issues, for example?
And that's what we're gonna have to coax you back, Stephen, to talk about that stuff, because we want to see. I know that you're still in the analysis stage of your project and things, but so when maybe once it's completed, you'll come back and share with us kind of the practical implications and talk a little bit about. I know that you're talking about scales of loneliness and all that sort of thing. So we've still got stuff to talk about.
Absolutely.
So that would be great. Thank you. But thank you so much for that, Stephen. It's just fascinating. It was really, really important stuff, actually. And it's good food for thought. I think everyone here, it's good springboard. And I just wanted to say as well that Stephen's research projects are ongoing. I think it's fair to say, Stephen, you're always on the lookout for something new.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I'm a busy man, and they're always ongoing. And if the other thing to say as well is obviously that I haven't had a brain injury. I'm just someone with an interest, and I've worked in brain injury for a long period of time. But if there are any individuals, and they don't have to be individuals who've had a brain injury either, who have an interest in doing research or helping to actually forge forward with particular questions that they think might be interesting or are pertinent to the brain injury community, then I'm more than happy to sit down and have a chat. If anyone wants to get in touch, just drop me a message on Twitter.
Yeah, brilliant. No problem. Thank you so much again, Stephen. Really appreciate it. Thank you, and see you soon.